so that way the others can join us in. All right, we're in our second session here of RP341 ethics, and today we're going to look at today we're going to look at the categories of ethical approaches that you're seeing in the textbook. You're putting to your charts together. I noticed the other day one of you has posted your chart. Great. If you haven't finished that, you still have till Friday to do that. All the assignments for the class are due on Fridays. I'm going to get my, here, forgot to get out my calendar for the class. What I've posted is discussion 1, and I've seen that you all have responded. I'm going to grade that today, tomorrow, everything that's been submitted. The ethics comparison chart, where you're going through the textbook and filling in that grid of that Word document that I gave you. Just expand it. You don't have to fill it into one page, just take it a number of pages. And the vision for that is not only that you're going to summarize it and use it as you think through the assignments that we have for this class, but you have it as an opportunity for teaching others and interacting with other people as they inform you about decisions they've made, as well as you have the opportunity to help people to think through as we're interacting with people in our world. There's going to be a different structure than what our author uses. Our author has 3 broad categories for these 11 ethical approaches to ethics. We're going to give it a different grid through the worldview today as we think of each one, but we're also going to introduce a grid for Christian ethics, which is going to use some of the terms, but hopefully this will help us. But bear with me as you go through the class. Ethics and moral reasoning is where we're going to talk through that process. Then we're going to get specifically into the Bible and how that enters into our thinking as Christians, and then specifically ethics in the Old Testament and New Testament, and then cultural cases. I'm just looking down through the schedule here. The discussion question 2, I'll post that after we get done with our discussion today. I'll give you the question and then it'll be posted there. What I want you to do for this next discussion question is use the grid of thinking when you respond with options. I'm going to give you a problem or an issue in life and think through options. What would be different ways people would take it? And not just a Christian worldview, different options that people would have. Now, the context is somewhat a religious or Christian worldview, but step back and think of people from a broader perspective. And what would be the ethical approach that each of those options are using, and each of the ethical approaches for the textbook categories, just those broad categories we're thinking of, to emphasize that. As we get down with other discussion questions, ethical problems that are going on in the world, I'm going to ask you to use just a slightly different grid when you identify your options, but bear with me, don't worry about that today. The biblical case study is out there. You're selecting a topic, and let me know if you have any issues, questions about which one that you're going to use, or another one other than the options that I gave you, those 9 different situations in the Bible, where I want you to think through what were the options afforded to the person? What's the problem? What's the dilemma? What are the options the person could have used, as we either see in the text biblically, or we step a little beyond that. They could have done this, and that's not talked about, so that's permissible. But definitely we have some biblical data. Then they make a decision. What prompted that decision, do you think, from what we see in the text, the textual evidence? And then the final part of that paper would be to think through, all right, now that I see the decision and some of its consequences down the road, evaluate that in light of how we approach a decision. We can't see the consequences. We're going to talk about that briefly when we talk about consequentialism today. and definitely in the future. But can we anticipate? And yes, we can. We can't predict because we're not God what the consequences will be, but it'll help us to think through as we approach decisions, not being able to know the consequences, but to yet be able to think through that aspect of it. Then next week, I think it's going to pop up the cultural case study, and you're going to select one of those for your final paper and write that up and present it. The biblical case study, I want you to do an oral presentation. If you're able to be online each day that we do the class, then you could just make it right online and the recording will be in there for everybody to see. If you can post it before here Tuesday afternoon at 1 o'clock, then I'll be able to show it. If not, I'm probably just going to have to view it myself, but maybe I could fit it in with the next class period for us to all see, because on that fourth class day, I'm designating time, primarily time, most of the time for, or a good share of the time for us to present our biblical case studies there. Maybe we'll get them in that meaning that fifth week, maybe not, depending on the time. But I want you to make a presentation, and then I'm going to talk with you. If we can talk together, let's see if we can maybe schedule that too. And then I'd record at that time and include it with the others. Questions either of you all have? Josh and David, you're online. Either of you have a question?
So when we pick our biblical case study, should we email that to you and make sure you're good with it, or what do you want us to do?
You don't have to, but if you'd like to, just to get some more input or process a little bit, I'd be glad to. But you're very free to take one of the topics that you see there and write it up. Just make sure you understand which way, how to approach it.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Good. You bet, Josh. David, let's see. You've got a question, and I've got a bubble down. Now, David, you said something. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you just responded with a thumbs up or something, and I heard it click, make a sound. But I don't see a note that you said. So I'm assuming that was just you're okay with it. Let's go from there. Let me lead us in a word of prayer for today, and then we'll talk about the different systems that you're seeing to ethical approaches to each of the questions that we have. Let me lead us in prayer. Father, thank you for your love and grace. You haven't left us alone. You've given us all that pertains to life and godliness. And so for this course, we know your word is sufficient. It'll provide us what we need. Your Holy Spirit is definitely sufficient for helping us to walk by faith in you and live a life that pleases you. And Lord, you've given us the body of Christ to give us wisdom to help us process things, that we could make wise decisions as well as respond to the circumstances of life that maybe we've caused or others have caused, positively and negatively. But Father, just thank you for that context for us, and give us a greater understanding today of other people and why they think as they do, Father, that we would have that sensitivity to understand things that they're doing that just make sense to them, and things that are not bad, but perhaps they don't conform to your will. But Lord, just help us to understand all these things today a little bit better. That's my prayer for Christ's sake. Amen. Amen. Let me, David, look back and see. If anybody had a question. Nope. All right, we're there. If I can get it right, let me share my screen. I got a PowerPoint up. All right, I'm going to ask somebody to respond there, Josh or David. Do you see that PowerPoint slide?
We see PowerPoint, but the whole oh, there we go. They're at launch. So now we see the
There you
slide.
go. Now you got the whole thing. Good, good, good. Thank you much. Week 2, major ethical approaches. And I'm just going to click on through that and talk. Somewhat duplicating what you're seeing in those texts in one sense, but yet trying to summarize what we see and maybe even add a little bit more. Why do people decide as they do? Well, because it seems right to them. It seems moral, they would maybe use, but it's their morality or their definition of morality. When we're dealing with the world and people that we don't know their worldview in one sense, we don't know their relationship with Christ in another sense, for sure. We got to stop and step back and look and observe and maybe listen, ask questions more than make a conclusion as we're trying to get to know them and trying to evaluate why do you hold that viewpoint? Why would you do that? You know, we look at the news every day and we see the politicians making their decisions and they're all arguing one to the other and in a sense saying that's stupid. Well, they're making a value judgment about another person's decision, but to that person, it makes sense. I follow my wife and I, like we've been to Israel, and so we're following a daily. It's not a blog; it's a news broadcast from Israel on a Christian Israeli TV station, you know, Israel 7 News, and as they're talking about what's going on in Israel, for example, relative to the judicial reform that's being proposed there, I'm trying to understand what's the tension. They got a different political system. It's not um, they don't have a constitution. And so there's something that's driving them on one side to say we need to make changes in the judicial processes. And then there's those on the other side that say what we have going on is very fine. And if we were to change it, we would lose democracy. And I don't understand that, but it makes sense to each side. That's all I'm trying to illustrate there. There is an epistemology, an authority that's driving them to come to the conclusion they have. Maybe they've thought it through, maybe they haven't. Maybe they have a good grasp of from that epistemology, then comes their metaphysical understanding. I'm just using worldview terminology, where their source of authority, we're going to ask that, what's their authority? And as we think of each of these ethical approaches, and from that authority, they hear that which exists, what's reality about existence? Is there a God? That's one of the ontological questions. What are really we like, though? What's our nature? What is good? What should be valued? That authority structure says things to me and to them and to everyone, whether they've thought it through or not, that defines good. What is the purpose of either the decision, the purpose of the context? Where do we see a logical progression toward an end, either of the immediate decision or of all things, if you want to take it broadly? But then what is that ultimate end even? You know, I said purpose and confused that with end. Teleology does have an end in view. There's an intended purpose for it. It could be just that purpose of a a gas pump in a car is to pump the gas. But the purpose of people, we would say biblically, is to glorify God for all of eternity. All right, so there's a mixture of the thinking you could have. But why do people do what they do? That's really what we're looking at today. That's what our author in the book, the um, road signs or the um, ethics that you see on a bumper sticker ethics is what I was thinking, road signs, wasn't it? But the ethics, everybody has a system that works for them. And so we're trying to think that through today. Work that way, trying to advance a slide without. Oh, I can't get it. There we go. Just what I was talking about. Each of us has an epistemology, a source of authority that we look to tell us what's right and wrong. what's moral, what's immoral, and then those different categories. That which is in our book, and I've added an extra one, those are the different broad categories, the ethics menu, we've called it here, for the textbook itself. Not the three broad categories, but here are all of those that are listed. And I've added at the bottom Christian ethics. I think our author, it'd be fair to say that he has put Christian ethics within divine command ethics, because we'd agree with that. But I'm going to separate out that 12th one, and that's where we're going to spend the majority of our talking. It's a subset of divine command ethics, but it's a unique approach in itself, I think. As we're going to get through it, you'll see the difference. Ethics with no room for God. Ethics with God misunderstood, and ethics with God as a major source of authority and focal point. Well, let's start with those ethics with no room for God, meaning as they look at their authority structure, God's not a part of it. God, and we'd have to use air quotes to use that term there. Cultural relativism, ethical egoism, behaviorism, evolutionary ethics. Let's just skim through them. As you have read the book, you're seeing different people talking. Man is the measure of all things, Pythagoras. When in Rome, do as Romans do. Now, that statement by Protagoras, I should have an H in there, Pythagoras. No, that's two different gentlemen. Man is the measure of all things could fit for several of these ethical systems, but yet we're looking at people is really what cultural relativism is all about. As our author in the textbook said, it's when in Rome, when you're around others and how do they act, you act like them. Paul in 1 Corinthians says, when I'm around Jews, I act like a Jew. When I'm around Greeks, I act like Greeks. Okay, it's somewhat the same sentiment. He's saying something different here. But people decide the authority for their decisions is, will I fit in? What does everybody else say? We all feel peer pressure. So there's a sense in which we're all compelled to make decisions on the basis of the crowd. All right, we got to think that one through. Cognitive relativism, Judea, or the Jewish, the Christian reality. There is a knowledge within a specific cultural milieu that just seems natural. It's normal. The Christian college culture, we could say. There's a relativism. I make a decision relative to that cultural context is what we're talking about. Questions that come up with cultural relativism are who gets to be the decider? I mean, that sounds a little odd, but it's a question about why did the culture come to that position? So there's maybe history to ask about it. The Islamic reality, who decided there? The Amish reality, who decided there? Do moral principles change? Is relativism self-defeating? Cultural relativism, meaning there's no absolute truth, is a statement of truth, meaning everything's true in that context, but in another context, that might not be true. Moral relativism, cultural relativism. Is moral improvement possible? We're struggling with CRT and white privilege, and seems to be that some of those that espouse critical race theory say there's no way for white people to change. That's just the way you are. That's the way you're always going to be. It's a cultural relativism in one sense. Is tolerance always good, meaning tolerating that culture? So let's ask the question. I'm sort of bouncing around, but let's ask the question, what is the authority here? Well, there are people that decide based on the culture. No moral truth that applies to all people at all times. Rather, it just applies in this given context. Now, we're going to look at another system down the road, way of standing that I'm looking for the title. Not utilitarianism. Situational ethics. That's what I was thinking of. Sounds like situational ethics, but it's not. It's similar, but it's not. Um, to preserve order, a culture has to adopt rules. We're going to talk about deontology or duty. In this way of thinking, culture and giving honor to the cultural expectations are dominant. But is that good? If it's just relative to a culture, is that really wise? Is that best? It's a very practical ethics. What works here is what they're talking about. Question, comment, either of you that are online. Let's go to Ayn Rand. Ethical egoism. We put a word there with the ethics, and that sounds like a negative thing. And as you've read it, as you both have gone through, you're all going through egoism. He's egotistical. That's not what she's talking about. It can come across that way to people, that these people are egotistical, but yet they're saying, all right, we got to ask, what's the authority? The authority's self here. I determine what's right, what's good, what's true. That's one way of summarizing ethical egoism. Now, there's a sense in which we all default to this. We all ultimately say, it's right for me. And we assume it's got to be right for others. But really, what Ayn Rand was saying, if you pursue that which is best for you, then in the long run, that'll be best for others too. The virtue of selfishness, meaning going with the decision that would benefit me the most, promotes ethical egoism or rational selfishness. It just makes sense. Why would I do something against my own best interest? The idea that one should pursue self-interest exclusively. She was a capitalist, and her book, Atlas Shrugged, really clicked with a lot of people that are hard driving. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. They're just very self-interested and would be very much against the Christian putting others before self. That sounds very self-defeating. Why do that? Why not look out for things that profit self? And in the process, it helps. Now, we could think of just some illustrations of that if we had time to process as a group together. I go out for what is good for myself and my family, and others do the same, and we will have a consistently working culture. Now, it sounds like cultural relativism or not, though, but yet it benefits culture. Its self-preservation is best because eliminating anything that threatens life is evil. The interest of rationally selfish people do not conflict, she said. For Rand, the is, that metaphysical reality is self. And so there's the authority. That's what exists. That's what the most primary ontological reality is. The highest value is doing that which is for self, your own best interest. And then the end is I will achieve a good life for myself. Egoism is not being egotistical necessarily, reducing us to animals. But the best way to help others is not self-sacrifice. Now, here's where flags would go up, but it's to act in a way that forces others to help themselves. See, there's where they were hoping for. Now, I've also got on that slide the ethical egoist would reject mysticism, which asserts morality is originating from God, neo-mysticism, which replaces God with society. There's cultural. Emotionalism, no, I'm not going to act on that. And personal whim, no, I'm very rational. I'm thinking it through. What is best for myself? It addresses the is, ought, that metaphysical and then that ethical choice, the what ought to be problem. What do I decide? That's what that means. With the basic premise that one exists, the descriptive element, therefore one should, that prescriptive, if describing metaphysical reality, proscriptive, the ought, what should I do? I'll pursue the interests of that existence, being of myself. If I exist, then survival of the fittest, that's where that fits in. Sounds like evolutionary. Here's that blending with another one, but it's a little bit different. That second point on that slide, altruism. I don't know if you've ever run into that. I had an individual when I flew during seminary, I flew for a company, a fixed base operator at Dallas Love Field. And there was an individual there, another pilot, a female, didn't mean anything, but she identified herself as an altruist. She wanted to do that which is best for herself. So I think I'd classify her, as I knew her, as an ethical egoist, one who would agree with Ayn Rand. Altruistic ethics, morality based on others as beneficiary, are foolish, even dangerous, because it's not in my best interest. Why would I do that? She was a very gracious lady. As I knew her, didn't know her real well. It's not that she was just a selfish, egotistical person, but yet she was pursuing that which is the best. And I look at some of the decisions she made, and her decision ultimately worked out for others, not always, but that's the nature of life to some extent, but it made sense to her. Questions that come up with this, though. Does egoism understand reality, meaning at times we're egocentric? Humanity is evil. Self-esteem is at times distorted. So do they really acknowledge that? Is egoism too optimistic about ourselves and our potential because of that inherent bad side of us we could put in? Is egoism self-defeating in that if I'm to choose just what benefits myself, and in the process, egoism says it will help others, but is that self-defeating if I have no viewpoint of trying to benefit others? Because ethical egoism, in its extreme, doesn't. There's no community possible. It's all about self. Does egoism permit justice? And if so, who determines it? Because in this system, what's just is what I like, but in the process of someone else's hurt, is there no justice for them? Wouldn't their self-interest be to bring justice? See, there's where the questions. Does egoism misunderstand altruism? What's the difference between us and them? People do warrant different treatments, and therefore, why are my interests always to be observed above others? Ultimately, this is an idolatry of self, is what it could lead to. Question, comment, anybody? Have you read anything by Ayn Rand? My oldest daughter read her book. She was an English major in college, and go back up. And she was entered a writing contest, and read one or two of her books, Ayn Rand's book, and got the scholarship from there. It was strikingly impressed with her thinking. I don't think negatively, but just it was a good exercise for her to think how some people live in the world. Behaviorism, B.F. Skinner. My dad, before he passed away at 59, with a brain tumor. He had the vision personally of starting, he was a guidance counselor. He had been a coach at Wheaton College for many years. He was an athlete. He was a world-class runner. And so he was hired at Wheaton College to run the athletic department, specifically the running program. But then while he was there, he got some master's degrees in counseling and was a registrar at a college, and then ran the counseling department in a high school district, and wanted to start a biblical counseling. And at that time, B.F. Skinner was the big secular target to talk about because he was very influential. Skinner, behaviorism. Our actions are not random personal choices, but the result of some previous cause. So you see the words determinism versus autonomy. I don't choose myself. I'm predisposed to answer or act in a certain way. We've looked at cultural relativism. I act because the culture. Ethical egoism. I act in my own best interest. That's my authority. What's behaviorism? There is this programmed behavior behind us that compels us to choose and to act and to think what's moral or immoral. It's really what he's getting at. Choice is an illusion, he would say. It rejects the soul. There's nothing in us that has a conscience, is really what he's saying. It's determinism versus autonomy. There was a book written by a husband and wife team, the Helds, I think is their last name. And the title was Hurt People, Hurt People. Now, they're Christian authors, but it sounds similar. So you think of that concept. I've been hurt by something in life, maybe my parents, maybe by a major life event. And as a result, I will react out of that. I've been determined, predisposed to behave in a certain way because of that hurt. Hurt people tend to hurt people. That sounds similar. That's a parallel to what Skinner was talking about. So I want to understand what my actions were caused. What happened? The actions are the results of predispositions based on internal or external causes. You could say even genetically, as well as behaviorally. From the womb, he would talk about. There's some sense to this. That's really what I'm trying to describe. Total depravity is not a category for him. It's rather learned, experienced, preconditioned behavior. Behavior is determined by the environment. Modify the environment, you're going to be able to modify behavior. So he was a behaviorist. He was the dog, Pavlov's dog. He was conditioned to salivate for food with the ringing of a bell. It was one of his, at that time, one of the big experiments that they demonstrated that we're all conditioned. And so we're conditioned, and there's some truth to this. But is this what determines us? Does this apply to God? Now, again, we're in a category where they don't even think of God. Is it just a stimulus response, or is there a determining God, a causer? All right, you could ask those questions. Does this mean there's no moral responsibility for personal choices? Should we punish people for what they cannot change? Isn't that ineffective and maybe even mean-spirited? I'm quoting from our textbook there. He's talking about evaluating this. So questions, where does God fit in? Is ethics simply just a cause and effect? Why ask why? Isn't that self-defeating? Behavior control was a big part of what he was encouraging as a counselor. We just manipulate the right action. We engineer behavior. We set the context, and we'll be able to determine the outcome. Now, we talk in our culture now of equity and equality. Equity is behind behavioralism. or behavioralism is behind equity and that push right now. If I set the right circumstances, I'll get the right outcome, is what they're saying. Our words imply choices, pro-choice, pro-life. DSM-5, the diagnostic manual there, the most current edition, the fifth one, determined behavior or changeable behavior. And we have had that discussion, the changes concerning homosexuality, transgenderism, being born this way. So there are those who, what's their authority here? The authority are the precipitating causes in my life that produce an effect, meaning that decision, that response I have. If I could change the causes, then I can determine the effect, the decision. The is are those contextual things that have happened to me or that have determined how I think unconsciously, and they determine the ought. So if I can make a better person, I'm going to change some of those things that have occurred, manipulate behavior to get the results. And we have to think about that because there is some truth to what he was saying, as well as all these other ones that we've talked about, the cultural relativism, the egoism, and now behaviorism. The last one, the evolutionary. Survival of the fittest. Charles Darwin be the representative there, as you see. The difference in mind between man and higher animals, great as it is certainly one of degree and not one of kind. We are just a higher functioning animal. You're familiar with this, I'm assuming, as you've walked with Christ, and that's one of the big questions. Is evolution correct? And you're thinking it through. Sociobiology is the key. Natural selection, social Darwinianism. Animals are justified in acting like animals, and we're all animals. We just have a higher intellect from our textbook, page 80. If nature extinguishes barbarism, why not nudge nature along by exterminating those who are a drag on humanity? And so we see people like Margaret Sanger, the head of Planned Parenthood, eventually, a eugenicist. We see the Nazis and they're adopting Margaret Sanger and others thinking about different races. The epigenesis and internal, the genes, desire survival, the survival of the fittest. The natural properties are innate in us. We're genetically programmed in a certain way. Carl Sagan's comment in the book Cosmos that he wrote, the cosmos is all it is, ever was, and ever will be. Therefore, and so we hear him talking about all that exists is just matter. It's been conditioned by, if we could use that term, the inherent properties of nature that are in us. That's what's eternal, matter and those inherent properties. And therefore, the end is we just go back to a new mixture of those properties after death. You hear their metaphysics. The questions, though, the is and ought question. Why should he, a person, care or act? If there's no sense to it, just randomly do what you want to do at that point. Altruism cannot explain this. There is no right or wrong in evolutionary ethics. The reduction to genetics is problematic. Where does free choice come from? Now we're talking back in behaviorism. Was I compelled by what? No preconditioned cause except that which is programmed in us. There's no explanation for good. What is good has to be in air quotes, or just, or diversity, or existence, even. So it's somewhat self-defeating. That last one, Stairway to Heaven. to become godlike, to be the strongest, to survive. So what is heaven? That's your highest good. Sound like egoism, but it's very selfish. And so was egoism, very selfish. Science will purify the human nature. It's just manipulating the data in that sense. So we've looked at some people that approach life without a conception of a supreme being. It just doesn't need it. It's either I make my choices because I've been influenced through genetics, through behavior, through the culture, through my own self-interest. And that's how they make their decisions. When we face, or we're talking to somebody and we're facing the same potential decision, and someone answers differently, we got to step back and say, what's compelling them to answer that way? Well, it could be one of these precipitating motivators in their lives, that ethical approach, that metaphysical reality in their mind that comes from what they determine to be truth. And that truth could be in science, could be in self, could be in circumstances, could be in genetics, could be in that altruistic, what's best for me. Questions, comments, anybody? Let's shift to the second category in our author's textbook, ethics with God misunderstood. There's a supreme being of some form, a supreme entity, an intelligent designer, perhaps. Those are in that movement. Would maybe they would be thinking along these lines. And notice the 4 different categories our author in the textbook covers: bumper sticker ethics, their utilitarianism or consequentialism, Kantian ethics, deontological, virtue ethics, and then narrative law ethics there. That last one's sort of an interesting one, not very prominent, but as you're going to see from the textbook. But the first one, utilitarianism, we're going to come back to these terms, and consequentialism in a different angle. But let's just think of somebody making a decision because, I'm going to use the word God, there is a consequence that should be sought, should be expected. And who raises that expectation? The greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now we're thinking beyond ourselves. That Jeremy Bentham is a good representative. If it feels good, it must be right, is part of it. Human nature, excuse me, is subject to 2 masters, pain and pleasure. Truth comes through our own senses, and we're going to seek, and sounds like egoism, we're going to seek that which causes the most pleasure, the consequence, pleasure, the consequence, avoiding pain. All right, you hear what's going on here. The highest good is happiness, meaning minimizing pain and maximizing pleasure. God created us to enjoy life. Again, that's air quote God. Therefore, we're going to reduce pain and in the process, thus reduce evil, because pain is evil. Well, how do you define evil? Well, that which God has programmed into us. So this could be very much a deist. Yes, there's something beyond us, but they've programmed us. And so we must look at that appropriate intended outcome. Instead of the systems without God, which who determines what's right or wrong? Well, just the culture, yourself, your circumstances, evolution. Now there's something outside of us that we must factor in. And utilitarianism, what works? That's that utilitarianism aspect. But the consequential, what works to produce the best results? 4 sanctions that keep people from being immoral: physical sanctions, the consequence, physical harm. Moral sanctions, public opinion. Again, there's that cultural relativism element, but now there's this God has put in all of us. Religious. Now we're bringing in perhaps the thought of a supreme being, perhaps just We are programmed to act in morally upright ways. Consequences will suffer in the afterlife, so I make decisions now. And then political sanctions by judges, magistrates, for example, will be sent to prison. That would be evil. Therefore, I will avoid certain things. Security in numbers, that public opinion. Second one is a consensus ethics even. Bentham had a grid through which he took his decisions. Later in the course, I'm going to present a Christian ethical grid for thinking how to make decisions. But notice what he used just in arriving at a good decision. These are the context for him to make a decision using a utilitarian thought, a consequentialism way of thinking. How long, the duration of the problem, how long do I conceive that it will occur, or how long can the results, if I make a certain decision, occur? Consequence. The remoteness, how distant is the effect of my decision here? How far from me is it going to ripple out? Is what he's thinking. Purity, how free from pain? Not every decision causes the same degree. I was just the individual that was on the phone with this morning was just talking about his own life situation. Talked to him yesterday in church. He's one of the elders in our church, and he has just been diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer. And yesterday he talked with the surgeon about possible surgeries they could do to treat it. Unfortunately, the cancer's metastasized. So these questions, utilitarianism, come in there for him. It's just, all right, if we do surgery, the recovery from the surgery might kill you. All right, do you hear how this is? Again, people make decisions like this, doesn't matter what their religious perspective is. We do think of consequences. And then he's going to talk to the oncologist about any type of chemo treatment. Same thing. The question that was put before him last week was, some of these options will affect your quality of life. Some of them will affect the quantity of life. Some of them will increase the quantity, but significantly decrease the quality of your life. All right. These are the kinds of options we're faced with. But if that's the only decision, I'm going to step away from our friend or elder there at church. But because this is a person who's looking just at making a decision on the basis of the anticipated quality and duration and purity, fecundity. Will it lead to more pleasure? Is this decision going to increase that which is conceivably a good? If there's a good God, he created us for good and experiencing a pleasant life, therefore increasing the pleasure is the greater good. The intensity, how powerful will it be? We all feel different degrees of pain and pleasure. The certainty of it, how certain? And then the extent, how many people will be affected by this pain or pleasure decision? Questions that come up. There's a gentleman, John Stuart Mill, was also a utilitarian. Can
Yeah.
we have? Yes, go ahead.
So didn't Mill, if I'm remembering from philosophy class a while back, didn't he kind of expand on Bentham because he realized that if pleasure was the greatest good, then nobody in society would show up to work. They'd just be drunk and partying all day.
Yeah,
So wasn't that, didn't they
yeah,
have to expand utilitarianism just to include some, I think Mill put in some level of like academics must be better than partying, or work is like productive, so productivity is good, just because they realized if they wanted a utilitarian society, they actually had to have enough of an incentive to have a society.
yeah, you're probably right. I'm not totally up on John Stuart Mill, but that would make sense with everything that I understand about utilitarianism. Good point. Some questions, though, to ask of the utilitarian. Can we have certainty of results? That's a major one. So we're going to talk later as we get through the course. There's something else we have to factor in, but as I was just using my friend there, the other elder at church, that he's thinking of consequences. And what he said is, all right, I want quality of life. I'm not going to care about quantity. I know I'm going to pass away, so I want quality. Is that a bad decision, an ungodly decision? No. It's a decision. So we all use this thinking, but they are compelled uh, even more so. So they struggle with the certainty of the results that they anticipate, and at times they are wrong about the results. And there's the problem with it. How to quantify comparisons or the results? How to measure the extent? I mean, what is fair? What's honest? What's just if it's only determined by numbers? Um, what was the movie? I've not seen it. Schindler's List. Schindler was buried. He was a non-Jew. He saved Jews. What did he save? 1,200, something like that. You just think of the numbers. Was it worth everything that he did? He's buried in uh, the Yad Vashem cemetery in Jerusalem, if I remember right. He's buried in Jerusalem. He's a significant. They really appreciated him and many others that helped the Jews. If it's only determined by numbers, there weren't that many people. So you're thinking, I'm going to make a decision that's going to expose me to hurt. Should I do it? All right, see, there's utilitarian thinking. Can we know the rippling effect of our choices? Survivors of abortion, there's another one there when you think of the ethical choice. Those that talk about the decisions their parents have said, we were thinking of aborting you. Wow. What if you had made that decision? I wouldn't be here to have this thought. But that's utilitarian ethics. Who makes the decision? Not rules. Only the results. So strict utilitarianism seems to be we're just looking at anticipated results, and it's hard to anticipate and hard to foresee them. Deontological. We're going to use this term for sure in the future. It's not a bad term, but Immanuel Kant seemed to exemplify it as a good example. It's your duty. We're bringing in here almost a universal ought in our lives. There is programmed into us things that we must do. Trying to describe it. This thinking here. What universal principles must I follow? Being good is a matter of reverence for duty. Our author, I'm quoting from our textbook here. Here's a quote from Fundamental Principles of Metaphysics of Morals by Immanuel Kant. Therefore, imperatives are only formula to express the relation of objective laws of all volition to the subjective imperfection of the will. There's where the decision factor comes in of this or that rational being. For example, the human will. We have the golden rule. You do unto others, you have them do unto you. These principles are discovered, or laws we could even say, are discovered by reason. They just seem reasonable, seem right. Now we're going to talk about natural law. There's things that seem to be programmed into us. Now we're not talking natural law here, but there is a duty that seems to be felt by many people. Can't say most, can't say everybody for sure, but there is an oughtness that drives us. Categorical imperatives, hypothetical imperatives. Well, let's go on and read. And that's what Kant talked about. Now, all imperatives command either hypothetically or categorically. The former, hypothetically, represent the practical necessity of a possible action as means to something else that's willed, or at least which one might possibly will. The categorical imperative would be that which is represented in action as necessary of itself without reference to another end, meaning as objectively necessary. If now the action is good only as it means to something else, then the imperative is hypothetical. If it's conceived as good in itself and consequently as being necessarily the principle of a will which is of itself conforms to reason, then it's categorical. Oh, shoot. Trying to click the next one. There is therefore but one categorical imperative, namely this: act only on that maxim whereby thou canst at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Categorical, that which is absolute, a general axiom, a value, therefore a means to arrive at a specific moral rules that apply to everyone. So the deontologist is trying to find those basic laws or rules that innately apply to all of us, categorically, and then that hypothetical. The imperative of duty may be expressed thus: act as if the maxim of thy action were to become by thy will a universal law of nature. Are my actions logically consistent or self-contradictory? Our author concludes there. So duty ethics is what we're talking about, in intuitive. It feels right. Now I say that feeling sense. There's a little squishiness there when we think of the other ones, but I've got to find it's the right thing to do. It's sort of an innate, is what we're describing here, based on a synthesis of reason and experience, something inside and something outside. And so the question, are these higher order principles or conflict? The conflict of duties? Is it okay to lie to protect an innocent person? That's a common question that we have come up. Which is right? My duty is to tell the truth. My virtue would say I should protect the innocent, and I have a right to protect the innocent, a duty there. So you hear the conflict. Do circumstances never matter? Is reason sufficient? Where is love in duty ethics? Next, virtue ethics, Plato, Aristotle, and a number of others. Plato, the function according to a tripart person, appetite, spirit, and mind. Aristotle, instrumental versus final good, happiness. Virtue as the mean between two vices, the golden mean. In this, virtue is aiming at the ideal, the development of character and relationships is what they were trying to struggle with. Character, who should I be amongst? Community, character, community is involved in this discussion. Character is a disposition to act in certain ways. The results in good acts, what we're talking about. A non-Christian can only live by rules. A Christian can live by rules also, but for us, then it's legalism if it's just by rules. There's more that's involved. Therefore, the inner qualities and motives are more important, and hence virtue starts coming in. And so we have this God conception. Now, we're not talking Christianity here. We're still talking about people that feel the higher moral responsibility. And now, instead of just duty, it's characters being entered in there too. We, in just a sideline, 1 Timothy 4:8, that we should pursue godliness. Seeking virtue is good. But questions that we have, are there conflicting virtues? Should I be compassionate to the criminal or to the victim? And is that mutually exclusive? which are actually virtues. And there's the long listing that goes in with that when you read people. God alone is good. All virtues are identified by him. So how do we determine? Is it elitist, this thinking, virtue ethics? You can't figure it out on your own, but it's saying, I can. That's somewhat what they're determining. Question, comment. I've skipped through a couple here. Narrative Ethics by Hauerus. That's how his name should be pronounced. The moral of the story is our bumper sticker sign from the book. The point of life is not getting the right answer, but becoming better people. Again, virtue ethics sounds like part of it. Our story defines our being. Okay, now you're looking at behaviorism to some extent. It's influencing, so there's a merging. Depending on our life experiences, our story, we see the world differently. Now, maybe we could make an analogy to some of the studies that go on in universities. People see everything through gender. People see everything through race. People seeing everything through feminism, Black studies, critical race theory. The story is more important than the morals. And so we talk about intersectionality. And that's a big part of how we're to decide what's right and what's best. And so there we have some good examples contemporary. But the questions are, whose story is correct? If they're all relative, then is there someone who has a right story, and who can determine what's wrong? If it's just right for me and another person can have what's right for them, how am I to say that they're wrong and I'm right? We don't read the Bible. It reads us, those that are Christian who would follow this narrative ethics. We read our story into it, and there's where they're trying to redo the Bible. I wonder with the latest push with AI, what kind of Bible will come out of it. Some have said we need to rewrite the Bible using AI. And what would that mean? How will they write it? What ethical perspective will they take? And what will they rewrite? All right, we talked about approaches. There are people that approach making choices, determining what's right, what's wrong, what's moral, what's immoral, without any conception of a supreme thought, supreme being outside of themselves. There are those that have that concept of something outside themselves misunderstood, call it God. And then there are those that bring in biblical thinking. I'm going to use that with air quotes because it's very broad. There is an Islamic biblicist, meaning they've got their book, they've got their epistemology in something that's outside of themselves, an authority structure. And so that's what we're thinking of here with Christian ethics, situational ethics, natural law. Boy, did I spell that wrong. Loss. Let me go back up that slide. Loss ethics. It should be natural law ethics. Got to change that. Divine command ethics, and then I add in Christian ethics. Situation. Now, again, we're thinking of people that have this conception, there's a God, and maybe you can even say Christianity, but the situation determines what's right. And it comes out of all you need is love. God is love. Therefore, I make all my decisions on the basis of what is the most loving decision. We do good when we act in love. Now, again, I put it in air quotes myself. There are 6 principles. Only love is intrinsically good, and it's normal for Christians to love, or moral people to love, if we can back out of that word Christian there. Because there are people that say, I'm a good Christian, but they don't follow the Bible at all, but yet love is the highest good for them. Love and justice are the same. Love desires neighbor's good. The end justifies the means. Utilitarianism sounds like coming in there. Decisions should be made situationally. If love is good, and if loving our neighbor is the highest good, then whatever you do, as long as it's loving, you can do it. Now, we're saying this is God considered, not God misunderstood. It's still misunderstood, isn't it, in certain ways? What determines what is most loving now and here? Do I know the total situation? What's included in the word love? How do I determine that word love, the meaning of it? Is situational ethics selective? Does situational ethics take sin seriously? Those are questions we got to ask. Ethics is the middle ground between legalism and antinomianism. And so we bring in this conception of love with situational ethics. Now, people justify a lot of things using situational ethics. You know, most often the examples are like that first question that I gave you. A Christian couple is they're committed to each other. They've got the wedding license in hand and the wedding scheduled. What's keeping them from consummating the relationship before the wedding night? Situation. Yeah, they're not doing anything that's inappropriate. They aren't doing it with anybody else. Why not just express their love now? They love each other. Why not consummate it? Situation ethics enters into possibly into the thinking. Another natural one, natural, use the word natural, next step rather, is natural ethics. Thomas Aquinas. We could call this natural law ethics. There's a within Catholicism, as I'm seeing it, maybe some of you all have studied natural law. There is some merit to arguing with non-religious people using a natural ethic. It's a person who's seeing there is a supreme being, a creator who's programmed us, put into our world natural laws, and I'm going to honor that which God has programmed in us. I'm not going to use the Bible. I'm just going to use that which is in general revelation. See, that's where I'm talking right now. What do I see in nature? Doing what comes naturally, meaning all people have a natural moral consciousness, is probably a good way of saying it. Nature, logic reveal that God is rational. The world is full of things humans need. What humanity needs is good. The highest need is rationality. Reason, didn't write that one. Reason's highest need, thus, reasoning the highest need, thus, reason should guide action. The inclinations common to all people is what we're talking about. Good should be done and evil avoided. All people innately know the difference between the two. Example, the common one that we give is you write a perfect paper, turn it into the prof. The prof says it's perfect. I've never seen anyone even better than that, using a qualifying term there. I'm going to give you an F. We go, wait a minute. That's just not right. What determined right? That natural sense of right and wrong. Romans 1:18, we're talking about general revelation. We're hardwired. We have it hardwired into creation, is what we say, by a good God. Christians and non-Christians should reach the same conclusions about what is good. Now, there's Romans 1 added into Romans 2, where Paul talks about even you that have the law, those that don't have law live better than those that do. Natural is how things ought to be, the ideal, the good, the right. Questions. I didn't have any questions with that. Oh yeah, question at the bottom. Clarity of natural law, how to interpret it. Works of the Holy Spirit in regeneration. When we bring that in, where the Holy Spirit changes our perspective toward the world, how do we factor that in? If are people all able to see good and right naturally? Yes, but not everything. I'm trying to qualify it with biblical Christianity. Yes, there's natural law, but nature has been corrupted by it. The last system that our author talks about is divine command. God said it, I believe it. That settles it. Now, this assumes the existence of, and I'm going to put in air quotes, God is the basis for morality, because we're still talking broadly. Though our author for sure is putting Christianity here, I think we need to take a next step and have Christianity. Even within Christianity, there's a gamut of ethical thinking. But here we would have to lump everybody that has an outside basis for authority in that which God has handed down to us, whether it's the Islamist who has the Quran or the Jew who has the Torah. Now, we'd agree with them in the Torah, but they have not had full revelation given, acknowledged the New Testament, Christ specifically, but there's special revelation. Morality is not a social construct. It's not personally affirmed even. The challenges are illustrated by Pascal's wager. Here's his wager. Blaise Pascal. God is or he is not. But to which side shall we incline? Reason can decide nothing here. There is an infinite chaos which separates us. A game's being played at the extremity of this infinite distance where heads or tails will turn up. Which will you choose then? Let's see. Since we must choose, let's see which interests you least. You have two things to lose, the true and the good, and two things to stake, your reason and your will, your knowledge and your happiness. And your nature has two things to shun, error or misery. Your reason's no more shocked in choosing one rather than the other, since you must of necessity choose. But your happiness? Let's weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then, without hesitation, that he is. And that's from Blaise Pascal's Pences. Questions? And I don't have them on the screen. Could God command cruelty? In Islam, God commands cruelty. Does God exist independently? Good exist independently of God? That's true in polytheism. Can we discount the role of reason, the faith in every man? How do we interpret commands? What's the role of the Holy Spirit? Why do non-Christians come up with the same laws, natural laws? Do divine commands still, are they still enough? What I just said is it just a matter of finding it? Now I'm sounding like deontology, and that's part of our ethical grid that we have to go through. What is my command? But is that all that God wants? Doesn't he also want a virtue? So I think there's a limit here with the divine command that we need to take a next step. And there's where we're going to go with more of the course as we try to lay out a grid for thinking through Christian ethics, a biblical ethic, for making decisions. But the question that our author presents there, which ethical model should I choose and why? And how to be certain that that's the best one? I began last week with that, just putting out this grid that Dr. Cohn presented there, where we definitely have to understand our authority. So behind every decision, maybe the person isn't aware of it. It just is unconsciously, they've been conditioned. There's the authority in their lives, whether it's the avoiding of pain, the experiences that they have, or their upbringing, or their peer pressure feelings. And that determines reality, the is, that epistemology and metaphysics. And from those, then I'm going to make my ought. That which ought to be, that which I'm going to decide, and it's ethics and it's social, political, social praxis, that which we have on the broader scale. The ethics is on a personal level by this chart. Socio-political is in that broader cultural question that we have. A couple more slides, though. Epistemological basis, there are sources of authority. If we take just what we've heard, deontological as reason, experience, the moral sentiment, experience, existentialism, experience, egoism, self, utilitarianism, experience. So you see how much people decide on the basis of what they've experienced in life. That hurt people makes a lot of sense at points. But divine command, which revelation? And here's a listing. Boy, all these different competing authorities that people can turn to, religious things that people look at, and many more that perhaps we'd add in there. Questions, comments, either of you all that are logged in here. Hope I haven't put you to sleep with all this long talking through. I'm going to stop sharing and bring it on back up here. Well, let me, for the sake of, we've gone about an hour and a half, and as I said, what we'd usually be, let me introduce the question for today. It's going to pop up discussion question 2. Finish up with question 1 if you all haven't, if you're looking at this video, and definitely be reading the textbook. You've been introduced to it. If you haven't finished it all, you've been introduced to it all through today. That's what I was wanting to do. And then you fill in your chart. But the question, should a Christian leader, and you can think of pastor, elder, deacon, ministry leader, and let me qualify that with your own context. Maybe you'd have a different term for the leader, but think of somebody who stands before others and represents morality. Not thinking secular, I'm thinking of somebody in a spiritual sense. For us, we definitely look at our pastor, elder, deacon, ministry leader. Should a Christian leader drink alcoholic beverages in public? Now, I come from my background, and my background would say, oh, no, definitely not. I see the milieu religiously in which several of my children, the churches that they're in, where their leaders say it's okay to drink, don't get drunk. Oh, well, it sort of goes against my background. Why do I decide what I decide? What are the options? Now, I'm asking you to think of what are the options in your cultural context. If you're from another culture overseas, I had a good friend that I met in the Air Force, Tom Terry. He worked with TEAM, the missions organization TEAM in Europe, and they were in Greece, and drinking wine is just a part of the culture. And when his oldest child, his daughter, his oldest child became a teenager, she started going to parties where they drank wine. Hark, the church. Should the leader? Well, that's the question we're facing. But he had to go through that ethical dilemma. And I say that just for deciding, we all make choices here. And so he had to decide, could she drink? Could she go? Could she drink? I'm asking the question, just think of your context, and maybe you have another context that you'd like to answer the question for, but if so, clarify in your answer. I'm writing it for this context, this country where I'm at. I say here, answer for your personal cultural context, for example, in the US, in another country, and then say what that context is, just real briefly. And answer the question. Use the questions that I have there in the discussion question. There's 3, 4 of them. And the second one, I'm asking in the options, identify, as you give the options, in that option question, identify, using the grid of our textbook, just for this question here, the question of what is the ethical approach behind that option, meaning that possible choice, and what's the ethical driver, approach, model, whatever term you want to use, behind another option. So just we can use our textbook a little bit more to think, and then we're going to use another grid as we go into the future. Just so you step back, you think of, well, there's there's something good about that option. I don't know if I agree with it, but it's an option. This is why somebody would choose it. So I'm asking you to think through why people would choose each option, identify with it. Question, comment? Either of you all that are listening in about that clarification for this question? Okay, you see your side, so I'm assuming that's agreement. Well, have a good week. Let me know any questions you guys have about assignments coming up, and we'll meet again at Tuesday here at 1 o'clock online. Have a good day,
Have a great
everybody.
week.
Josh, say again.
Have a great week.
Hey, you too. David, you the same. Glad to have you join us. Hopefully you're able to hear. Bye-bye.